chance for the valuation folks within the room to be able to discuss and really recap what we've seen and talk about the different aspects. So with that, we've got a couple of folks on the taxpayer side representing the consultant side. And I'm going to make a considered effort to reach out to some of the assessors out there too, because I want to make sure, these are all very complex discussion topics, and it helps for everybody to be in the conversation as well, not just us. But as far as the format will go, Mr. Wiggins from AT&T over here has a couple of slides that he wanted to walk through. This is really mostly demonstrative. There's some photographs of some sites, and I think he's got some recap of some recent builds that they're doing. And then Steve may talk a little bit too as well, but then I think we'll just kind of bring up some issues that we've identified along the way, and not only along the way, but along today, just thinking about the things that we're seeing and some of the challenges we see in the future. So, Gary, do you want to start?
So I want to talk about 5G. I didn't know 5G was referred to as a war with China. But as I started reading a bunch of federal documents, it seems we have a war with China on 5G and who deploys it first, most pervasively. And that, we're determined to win that war, and at the moment, China's probably ahead. So you'll hear that referred to more than once. The small cell thing, and Ian referred to it this morning, is an explosion of different locations where property will reside. And so like as you think about small cells, or all cell sites initially, by 2028, there'll be 1.3 million cell sites. And of those 1.3 million cell sites, 1 million of them will be new small cells that don't exist today. And so from a property tax perspective, your compliance burden and all the reporting and bill payment and all of that might get a little out of hand. Here's a slide that simply shows that. And it shows the small cells in black, and then shows the macro cells and what they do over time. They don't do much of anything, right? We put a few more in like we've been doing, but it's small cells that are a pretty big deal. The FCC has kind of jumped into this with both feet. And in September, they enacted nationwide rules that govern jurisdictions over what kind of restrictions they can require for small cells, right? And their incentive is to fix it. So local jurisdictions and restrictions that they put in place can't slow this thing down. So the reference to Austin not having any small cells, well, they're probably pretty crossways with the FCC, and going to get much more crossways really, really soon. So they passed their rules, or released their rules, September 27th, and they're said to extend federal authority in an unprecedented way in terms of the requirements they put on local jurisdictions and the latitude that they take away from local jurisdictions. And I found this next statement. It says, rules provided for under Section 253C, and it says, should be focused on protecting the interest of carriers. I don't remember the FCC ever having a focus on the interest of carriers. Their interests generally are on ratepayers and that sort of thing, right? You got some state and local governments that are pretty upset about all this. They believe the FCC simply gave the carriers what they requested. And, to be honest, they sort of did. These rules, first of all, maybe the most important rule is any of these fees for placement of small cells, they have to be cost-based. The jurisdictions can't use this as an avenue to generate revenue. They're really clear about that. The FCC is also focused on delay. And so they've established this criteria they call shot clocks, where you have 60 or 90 days to approve the applications that allow them to put the plant in place. And they get pretty specific. I guess it's 60 to 150 days. 150 days maybe for a new site in a new area or something. But these fees, they're very specific. They can only be nominal fees, one-time fees. They can range from $100 per site to $1,000 for a new site, but most of them probably be about $100 a site. And the rent that they can cap after that, or is capped after that, is $22.50 a month or $270 a year. A heck of a lot less than what a lot of jurisdictions want to charge, right? So the FCC was focused on this idea that if local jurisdictions put too many rules in place, they can bring this whole thing to a screeching halt, or maybe not a halt, but they could slow it down for years. So they wanted to avoid that and get rid of that opportunity. And so these rules significantly limit the authority of state and local governments to manage the public rights of way. And that's pretty contrary to most government's view of who has authority to manage the public rights of way. So they have aesthetic requirements. They didn't outlaw them entirely, but they said they must be reasonable and no more burdensome than other types of infrastructure. Spacing, again, same kind of thing. It can't be any more burdensome than other types of infrastructure. So it raises some questions in my mind. So as you read these FCC rules, they talk about fees. And so the first question I asked as I looked at it, well, are fees taxes? And I don't think fees generally are taxes, right? And the rules are silent when it comes to tax. They don't talk about tax one way or another. What I think we might see is we might see a property tax assessment for every installation of personal property. We might see a property tax assessment for the possessory interest in the use of the public property, that is to say maybe use of the light pole in the rights of way and so forth. And that's what would give rise to a pretty burdensome compliance issue, right? So I just asked the questions. Could we have a million new personal property accounts from small cells? Could we have another million possessory interest accounts related to the use of the real property, the government-owned real property in the public rights of way? Probably not a million, because we have unit states and that sort of thing, and you could have some grouping, but we could have an awful lot of them. We had some debate among ourselves about possessory interest and what they are. Possessory interest is the value of the private use of a public property, right? And it should relate to the value to that user of the public property. So anyway, I just wanted to raise those questions.
There is no economic value to 2023 or 2024 from what I heard earlier in the earlier presentation, just for the record.
You didn't expect that from Steve, would you?
Where do we want to go from here, guys? A couple things that I heard on presentations earlier today. We talked about, let's see, fixed broadband. So T-Mobile is in the process of going through an acquisition with Sprint. And I would suggest everybody to go out and take a look at the website, thenewtmobile.com. Okay, so there's information out there that talks about that proposed combined acquisition. And let me just give you a couple stats that are out there, at least on the competitive landscape. So fixed broadband, roughly 50% of households lack competitive competition currently for speeds of 25 plus megabits per second on a broadband. If you increase those speeds of 100 megabits per plus, right, the higher speed broadband, about 80% of households currently do not have competitive choice, right, or competitive competition. And that's what all the wireless carriers are looking at with advanced LTE and, of course, 5G coming down the road, that they all want to get into the broadband side of the house. And we've made it clear that we want to bring competition to the cable industry, both on the broadband front, right, and on the content front, with our upcoming release of what we talked about, Layer 3, and rolling out some sort of over-the-top service, similar to what YouTube just did the other day. They announced a nationwide live TV streaming service that brings competition to the content side of things. So that all puts pressure on the networks that are out there. We're not stopping, though. I mean, one of the things from our perspective is we've announced that we're going to spend, $40 billion over the next 3 years on trying to figure out how to integrate those networks. Well, what does that mean? A lot of that's labor, a lot of that's decommissioning. So if this deal goes through, we've publicly said we're going to keep about 10,000 of the Sprint cell sites. That means the rest of them are going to be shit canned, right? And we're going to do it in relatively short order. Sprint doesn't want to hear that, but at least that's the way that we look at it and view it. We did the same thing with Metro PCS, right? We didn't wait. We figured out how to rationalize the network and increase the cell sites that were there. I'm going to take. You got any other questions you want to add? I got some more to go. We can figure out how to play off each other here.
I might circle back with some of Gary's discussions on the compliance side, and then we could probably talk a little bit more about value. The first and foremost, the compliance issue I see is, first and foremost, these things are rolling out now for the next couple of years, and for all the influx and uncertainty regarding the fees that are going to be applied to these attachments. It starts to add up, and there's a lot of heterogeneousness when it comes to those placements. And it's only natural to think, of course, the cost of a site, or a small cell like this one, is going to be fundamentally different than a macro site or a rooftop tower. I mean, you think about just logistically, the address. I mean, what is the address of a street pole? How do you number them? How do you determine them? For jurisdictions that require you to render for taxpayers, they have to render the number of sites in that jurisdiction. I think Colorado's one, Arizona, New Mexico, New York City also does that too. So you put together a list, and already the assessor's thinking, okay, I've got a very accurate list of cell sites. I know from history my average number of cell sites, it's on average, it's about $100,000 or so. So I'm just going to take that number and then just multiply by the number of sites, and that's the number that I should be coming up with. Well, think about what's going to happen in the next few years. Like a place like New York City, maybe have 400 sites one year, and if they're really counting the number of base stations that are being placed, that number could go from 400 to 600 to 1,200 to 2,200, and all of a sudden the math is completely out of whack. And they're thinking they must be investing like crazy. The truth is they're just investing what they've done in prior years. That cash is flat. I mean, you follow the guidance that the carriers are putting out there. That investment really hasn't changed as a percentage of revenue that they're burning. I think that's a huge issue. I think that's something that those jurisdictions really need to look at. That's looking at it from a 4G and a 3G lens. Having those addresses, at least in Texas, you have that ability to work with the taxpayer and the assessor on at least consolidating some of those. I cannot imagine having to deal with hundreds and hundreds of $10,000 personal property accounts to sift through. Just imagine the challenges and the errors that take place from each of those.
Well, it raises a question: how many of those bills can a jurisdiction afford to issue when the small cell costs maybe $30,000, $25,000, something like that? This is something that both government and industry need to figure out a way to address, because some jurisdictions might not assess it at all because it's a huge compliance burden, at least on an individual basis, for not much benefit. So it would be probably good to get in front of it and try to figure out a way to manage it. Could you go into a jurisdiction and file one property tax return in mass and have it valued in mass? That might be one way to deal with it. But you'll have this, all these small cells spread all over, in the major cities and metro areas.
There sure is a absolute a positive if you're speaking to the assessor and the taxpayers are at least in discussions about how that's going to happen. Are we going to consolidate them? Are we going to identify them as different type of property, 5G property or whatever? Otherwise, if you just have a big bucket of stuff, or if you have single accounts, I think you could have issues with that either way.
Yeah, I don't know if everybody appreciates how simple these things are, but this is some stuff that was just built in New Jersey. So that's there's a couple of there's an empty pole, and then they added a small cell to an existing pole, right? And we did a little. That's another small cell that they added, also a new pole. And here we tried to, just describe what the widgets were. You got radios in those brown compartments, but there's not a lot there. It doesn't cost a lot to put that in place, and there's not a lot there in terms of infrastructure, not a lot there in terms of equipment either. So then that was New Jersey. There's some stuff in North Carolina, a little bit cleaner looking there. And then here's just some other pictures of small cells. Anyhow, the point is there's not a lot to it, and each individual assessment wouldn't amount to a lot.
Hey, Gary, I think it's just a matter of making certainly the larger jurisdictions aware of the coming issue. For example, in Florida already, some of the larger counties send you bills that are a grouping of cell sites by taxing jurisdiction. So Pinellas might send you one bill that includes 40 sites or 50 sites. And they roll all that data up and charge it to a master account, and then they fill that master account. So it's something that the counties can do. They certainly don't want to issue 1,000 tax bills because you've got 1,000 many sites across the county. That wouldn't make any sense at all.
John, is that 1,000 assessments and then one tax bill?
Well, it's not 1,000 assessments, but it might be maybe 15 or 20 assessments, okay?
You bring up a good point on that front, and I agree with you, right, that we do everything that we can to figure out how to ease our administrative burden. And I know that we work with the jurisdictions now in order to help do that, how we consolidate that, whether we give that as an attachment to a return, right, an Excel file or something else to make it easier for them also.
Well, in some of the counties, some of the companies actually report that way. They don't just roll all those numbers into one big bucket. They report on a location by location basis, an Excel spreadsheet, like their databases show. And that Excel spreadsheet is then used to roll all of those up into what they call master accounts, and those are what are billed. So there might be 100 sites in one bill, 100 cell sites in that one tax assessment and one tax bill.
There is a new issue here, though, in that possessory interest, because the possessory interest is an interest in real property, right? And it's generally up to the assessors to discover it and assess it, as opposed to filing annual tax returns. Now, should there be some revision in terms of reporting and that sort of thing to deal with it? Because for most all those personal property locations, if they're sitting on a city-owned pole, you might have a possessory interest issue there as well.
Yeah, see, I don't know about that side of it, as far as the real side is considered. But it would appear, or you would think, if there were that many individual sites and real estate people were going to try to get involved in it, certainly they would not want to issue that many assessments. I mean, just make it practical. I mean, it could only be a few dollars per poll anyway. But But I know there's a solution on the personal property side. And it works pretty good.
And you bring up a good point about looking at some of the transitioning too, and maybe I can talk about some of the generational issues that we have here. We had a question though. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say we do property taxes in Texas, and two questions, and the first one may have already been answered earlier and I missed it, but you mentioned the cost of these, it ranging from $5,000 to $30,000 installed. Is that the range of these small cells in price, cost?
Probably somewhere in that range.
But the second thing is, I think first of all, they have to be done by jurisdiction. So if you've got some fire district and some water district or whatever, you're going to have to report, or you don't have to, but I mean, ideally, these cell sites would be reported by jurisdiction. But I would think, and of course, I don't know in other states, but I think certainly in Texas, if you reported them by jurisdiction and requested a single account by jurisdiction, that may well be a way to get one value per jurisdictional entity. Does that make sense? So if you have 500 of these sites in the city of Austin in exactly the same taxing jurisdictions, then you could just report these on a spreadsheet with your cost and your year new and so forth under that jurisdictional heading. And if it was rendered like that, I think, and you requested it, I think most companies would give you one tax bill for that grouping of small cell sites, for example.
I think that's a great idea. I mean, that's definitely something that we should be sharing and discussing more. Becky?
Yes, I know in Bear County, we've got accounts with various multi-locations like that for the cell carriers as well as leased vehicles, leased equipment. And we carry it all on one account. And if you want to know where one particular site is, you give us a spreadsheet, we'll give it back to you with each site, which taxing jurisdictions that one site is. And at the bottom of the spreadsheet, it'll give you each taxing jurisdiction and how much value per taxing jurisdiction. So it'll summarize all the taxing jurisdictions.
I was just trying to highlight the volume. You look at all the cell sites we have today. We have a couple 100,000 cell sites across the country. We're going to go to over 1 million cell sites across the country.
And I need you to get that done with 30% less personnel, Gary.
Yeah, and reduce your property tax budget by 10%.
Thank you, John.
Heard that before. I think a bigger issue is that our fixed asset people know up front that cost needs to be isolated or reported or categorized as 5G equipment, not 4G equipment, or not just wireless radios or whatever.
Well, you have to be kind of careful with some of that, though. Like those small cells I just showed, those first ones, they're sitting there today, and that's what I was talking to Ian about, because those were the two that he mentioned. And I was talking to him about at lunch. They're about less than 150 yards apart, and they're not 5G. There isn't any 5G sitting out there yet. And so what are they? They're 4G. The 4G may evolve to 5G, so what we have on those cell sites, 4G and 5G, at least for some period of time, who knows. So my point simply is it might not be as simple as we'd like.
Yeah, but you and I both know that it's easier to provide obsolescence on the prior version as opposed to the new version. I mean, it just, to everybody that looks at it, it just makes more sense. I think the cost that ultimately is capitalized is also going to be an issue. I mean, I would imagine that everybody's going to have their own idea of what costs ought to go into that single cell site, that mini site that gets installed out there, as far as the installation goes.
There's a saying out there, at least our leadership has quoted it in the past, and it's very relevant, and that is all content is going to the internet, right? And the internet is going mobile, okay? And with that backdrop, we talk about T-Mobile being a wireless carrier. I would look at us as being an internet carrier, okay? And the reason I say that is most all of the traffic that we handle is data traffic. 90+% of the traffic is data. It's not voice, right? So it is basically a data connection, and we were providing data pipes, right, to our consumers. And the reason I bring that up is a timely article that came out today as I'm sitting in the back of the room, and it was from one of the commissioners, right, Rosenworcel, right? She happened to be on a panel just yesterday, and they covered the news today. And she was talking to the Internet Innovation Alliance, right? And I'm thinking the Internet Innovation Alliance. And what she's saying is the promotion for her was 2.5 gigahertz, right? Some of the school districts have space on the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum, which is where Sprint has a lot of their spectrum right now. But she's talking about that is an internet or broadband connection, right? And that's a new area to look at. And we're focused on the broadband piece of things. And so that's the way that I look at T-Mobile, is that we are basically an internet company, right, that happens to provide some voice traffic. But voice is going away because anybody younger than me doesn't even want to talk on the phone anymore. They're IMing me or texting me, right? And if I call them, they don't pick up the phone, and I have to text them and tell them, pick up the phone. We need to chat. So that's an issue, right? A generational issue, but that's the way things are going. And I bring that up in context because as we look at all of this generational equipment, and maybe we can bring the point back home, is that 4G is just not 4G. It's just not one piece of equipment that sits out there for 10 years. I mean, every carrier has gone through that stuff. T-Mobile was out there early on. We were marketing 4G. We didn't have 4G. We happened to have 3.75G, right? And we were calling it 4G at the time. We didn't call it LTE, but it met the technical speed standards. So our marketing guys jumped all over that. And we were competing against AT&T and Verizon, and trying to be the first with a 4G network out there. And ever since, marketing has been unrelentless, right? And we're out there now talking about 5G, and everybody's talking about 5G. And then you heard some of the timing differences that are here now. Let me give you a couple examples of at least how I see some of the changes that are swapping out. Even with LTE, when we built out LTE later, right, we were late to the market on LTE because we needed spectrum. And so when we were building LTE out in 12, 13, 14, and 15, right, to get our national footprint, there are different generations of equipment even within LTE. So when we go out to a site, I may see a first generation radio, and then there's also a third generation radio out there now, and they're swapping these things out. And the first generation, it doesn't provide the same capabilities or capacity, right, for these electronics. And it's the same thing with the antennas, right? The vendors out there on the antennas, they have these integrated antennas where they happen to put electronics in the bottom of the antenna along with the antenna itself. And if we need to replace the electronics, guess what? We need to go up and rip the entire antenna down, right, and swap it out. And that happens. And every time we have a truck roll or we have to have some equipment replaced on the site, it creates additional costs and burdens on the business. But that equipment is nowhere near, it may have a 15-year or even a 20-year. You want to call it a 30-year. It has a very long physical life, but from a functional or economic perspective, it is very, very short because it doesn't provide any capacity. Go ahead.
You guys can all jump on me now if you want to, or I'll buy you a beer when we go to the reception. But
So you're going to get that bad, huh? You're going to have to buy us a beer?
Look, I worked with all of y'all for 30 years, okay? So y'all know that I'm as fair as the day is long. But I just got to say this. At the same time, Steve, from the assessor's point of view, okay, if that old 3G switch or that old 3G radio or whatever it is sitting there working, doing something, if it's a cost state, it's got to be reported. Now, you may think it has zero value. So you report it and you show a zero value for it, but you don't just not report it because it doesn't, quote, add any incremental value to what's going on. Because, and here's the practical reason for that. If you elect not to report that old radio that has costs that's in service, and the numbers are significant, okay, then the assessor or his people have no confidence whatsoever in your numbers if next year everything below vintage 2013 drops off your return, or 2010, or whatever it is, because as inefficient as it might be, you still got some of that stuff out there and it's operating, and they know that. So your numbers have no, you know, they just really see that as a manipulation of the data.
In the end, though, John,
It may have zero value, and in the end, you're looking for the RCNLD, but they're still seeing that happen, okay?
Yeah, I don't disagree
Yeah.
with what you're saying.
Yeah.
I think the important point is, so in the end, you have to find fair market value.
Absolutely.
And if you take costs on the books and simply bang it against a schedule,
Won't work.
much of the time you won't get it.
That's true.
And there's several reasons for that, right? The equipment changes technologically very quickly. There's also because, you know, think of your cell phone and what it would do just a couple of years ago, what it'll do today, how much traffic you put over your cell phone today versus what you did a few years ago. Everybody's pulling all kinds of video.
Right.
Well, as much as your phone had to change, the equipment had to change as well, right?
Yeah.
And as technology changes, this equipment is very technology driven. And the price of that technology in terms of what it costs to replace the capacity and functionality goes down over
Absolutely.
time.
Yeah.
And so that's one issue that has to be accounted for. The other issue is the one you raised, is you have all these repeated visits to cell sites
Yeah.
and multiple climbs up the tower again and again and again. And the objective in terms of determining fair market value with a cost approach is to say, what would it cost me to replace that existing capacity and functionality as of the assessment date? And so those accumulated costs that are duplications of cost, if you build them in there, you won't find market value.
No, and I agree with you totally. I mean, and certainly year after year after year, we come to some numbers that are not too terribly far apart, okay? But it's using all of the cost numbers, or at least all of the cost numbers you report, which I always felt like were as many as we could find, okay? Whether they were all right or not. I'm just saying it's important that the cost numbers be reported. They may have a zero value. You may show a zero value. You start with the cost numbers. Most people do.
I don't disagree with that, John.
Yeah. And then and ultimately we're looking for the RCNLD that we all are trying to get to. In the states, like in Florida, you know, the counties do it a different way than Carl does and Jim does, because they've got to start with something that the state puts out there, because the state says if you don't follow my guidelines.
We could argue about that,
Yeah,
but let's not.
Yeah, okay. But you know where I'm going. I mean, you can't just drop stuff off because you think it ought not be reported anymore. You got to keep it out there.
You know, one interesting stat, I was talking to Jim today, and I asked him, you know, on average, how many times a year does a cell site carrier go out to the cell site to fix something or put on some new widget? He said about once or twice a year. I mean, once or twice a year. And you think about going over, you know, over the life of a 10-year lease or whatever, going up that tower 10 times, replacing something, or 12 times or 15 times, and think of those accumulated costs that go in, and they're not pulling stuff down. You know, they've got the capacity, the actually physical capacity to move up there, but it's all going up there and it's all staying up there. You know, how much of that cost is really stranded cost that we just cannot recognize? You know, how do you deduct those values? I think in defense of the RC and LDs that we sometimes see, I think, that was always the biggest thing that I get as far as questions go. Why is the last 2 years of CapEx, if you add that up, why is it less than the market value, or why is it more than the market value that you're trying to claim for the property? And I can point to those 2 years being, you've already visited the site 4 times. That's an immense amount of extra duplicative costs that had you gone out there at one time, you could have taken it all and not had to deal with the stuff that's already up there.
Another thing to add on to that is technology is changing so fast, and I can't keep up with it, and I'm in the industry. And let me give you an example on the changing technology. You heard about fiber being very important to get to all the cell sites, right? So they're bringing fiber to the cell site. We were one of the first ones to what we called push alternative access vendors, or we go to Comcast or another carrier in our market and say, we don't want to deal with AT&T because they're a direct competitor in the wireless, and we want to make sure that there's competition out there for the fiber business, right? So we want a healthy, active, competitive environment in getting fiber connections to the site. That's one piece of it. But as we've gone through, even in the 4G side of things, when we talk about LTE only, right? So you heard earlier that if we need to update speeds, right, for backhaul, and we want a gigabit service there, right? When we started out, we had dimensions out there, I think were 25 megabits or 50 megabit speeds for backhaul. And what did that mean? That meant that fiber came into the site, into a box, and it was the fiber provider had a box or connection in there for a piece of equipment, and then we had a box right next to it, right, that was an interconnect piece of equipment, right, or electronics on our end. Those electronics were maxed out at 25 or 50 megabits, so they had electronics there, and then we stepped up. We have electronics for 100 megabit service, and then 250 megabit service, and then 500, and then gigabit, electronics in there. And so we have gone back several times and kept swapping these things out every couple of years in order to increase the backhaul speeds. That stuff has a long, physical life, but from an economic perspective, we got to keep on updating that, and that's been about every, 24, probably 36 months, right? That we're out there continually swapping out this stuff. We're talking months and not years. So that's just another piece of, the equipment that's out there that we're continually swapping out.
John has a point. I mean, it is a lot of this, and we all know this. I mean, a lot of this is about trust. Having the ability to look at the person on the other side and believe that they're reporting everything to the best of their capabilities, the best that their fixed asset system can tell them, their electronic databases, and if that means having to seek out more information, by all means, see about requesting it from them.
Oh, no, don't get me wrong. I certainly, I don't want to say I'm a company person, okay?
You used to be a company person, John. I don't know that I would still call you a company person. Of course, as I think about it, we used to argue just as vehemently when we were on the same side as we do now on opposite sides.
Listen, there's a number over here and there's a number over here, okay? This is a radical number and this is a radical number. There's a number in here somewhere, okay? That's where we're going. I tell all of the counties that the companies don't have time to hide information, that they're always trying to provide the best information that they can, okay? Because I firmly believe that, okay? It's just like the jurisdictions don't have time to do the job they need to do because they don't have the staff to do it. It's the same thing. I know the companies do the best job they can. There's no question about it. So, don't blackball me, paint me black. Tar and feather me or something,
There's definitely something to be said about just those preventable problems and those things that we've talked about early on, and just coming up with some proactive measures as the 5G network starts to roll out. There's nothing more frustrating as a consultant, to have to go in and prove up the tax, what's being rendered on the property. I mean, this is this should have already been ironed out by now, by the time I'm coming in. This is not worth their time, for sure. We're there to talk value. So. Anything else to raise, Steve? You want to talk about? 2 more minutes.
Any other questions from the audience? One other thing I'd like to point out is that competition is wide and far, right? And I'll give some kudos to, we'll be here later on that, but Comcast is in the room here. Comcast has 1.2 million wireless subscribers, right, as of yesterday. They had a great quarter. Congrats to the Comcast team. But that's just one more competitive threat that's out there, right? And with this new T-Mobile, we've been an Un-carrier, and we look to continue to disrupt the industry. And we're going to do everything we can to keep prices as low as we can for the consumer, because we have the consumer at heart at the end of the day.
That pitch is getting a little old by now, don't you think? Good Lord.
Smooth. Very smooth.
You need to work on mine a little bit more, okay?
Working on it.
Has there been any state legislation that's being driven to address the voluminous reporting on cell sites? Gary?
Well, there's been there's been a lot of legislation passed. Like 21 states have passed legislation largely consistent with the FCC rules. But there's probably thousands of jurisdictions that have passed regulations contrary to the FCC rules. And the net result is that now you have a bunch of lawsuits have been filed challenging those FCC rules and the FCC authority to encroach upon what most people would say is local government jurisdiction. And there's a lot of concern about what will be the impact of that, and concern as to whether it might bring a lot of the build out of 5G to a screeching halt as people fight about the legality of what the FCC is allowed to do as they try to expedite putting 5G in place and winning the war they keep talking about with China.
Is Missouri one of those 21 states?
Missouri is one of those states, I believe.
What are some of the other states?
Well, there's a lot of states. There's 21 of them. I can't say the name. The one I remember reading specifically was Michigan. Michigan, passed some legislation largely in alignment with the FCC rules. And then you had, and I didn't, it was on some of the slides I had up there, I didn't go into it. You have states like New York that their initial rules are about double what the FCC allows in terms of fees and annual rent. So, you got them all over the place, and there's lots and lots and lots of them. So now we'll sit back and watch this litigation that's been filed challenging the FCC rules and see where it goes.
Thanks, guys. Great job.